Volt Typhoon is still ongoing. The Chinese have been inside of the networks for years now, and it's going to take a long time to get them all out. All right, welcome everybody to the latest episode of Headlines and History with me, your host, John Malik, episode 26. Here's what we're going to do today. I want to talk about something recent. I want to talk about a conference that I just went to. I'm going to merge a little bit of our Headlines and History podcast stuff with a little bit of what I do on the professional side, although they often correlate, but specifically, I traveled for work last week and attended a summit. They called it an intelligence summit. First time I had ever gone. And the topics that we talked about are pretty relevant to what we talk about here on Headlines and History. So we're going to focus more on the headlines aspect of everything, more so than on the history this week. But I thought some of the topics that were covered by some of the senior leaders that were there are really relevant to the national security sphere and the foreign affairs landscape, as you might imagine, right? So let's talk about this. Some key topics. I can't talk about everything, obviously, even though it was an unclassified forum. And some things it's just not worth getting into because we can only kind of talk around the edges. But there were certainly some key topics that I think are of interest to, certainly myself, but definitely to the listeners here. Okay, so most importantly, we talk about this every episode. I always put the disclaimer out there. Even though I'm still in the business, everything I say on the podcast is my opinion only. I don't speak for the DoD. I don't speak for the intelligence community. I don't speak for anybody else but myself. But I want to make that explicitly clear this week. Okay? I'm going to be talking about some topics that the DoD specifically is talking about. I'm going to reference some agencies that are involved, that were involved in the summit, and some of the leaders that were there. And so some of the things that I'm going to talk about were their opinion. Some of them were official points, if you will, that come from their agencies. But just nonetheless, if I have any commentary on any of that stuff, it's just going to be me. Just going to be me in my opinion, not the opinion of me in any official capacity. Okay. So also headlinesandhistory.com, been doing some work on the website. Head off there. Contact information is there. You can email me, John Malik at headlinesandhistory.com, and all the other stuff is there. So feel free to support the show. I'd be really grateful if you do. All right. What was this summit called? It was held down in the D.C. area. Okay, and specifically, it was the Intelligence and National Security Summit. It's been going on for, I want to say it was about 10 years. I mean, I think they talked about specifically when the first iteration was, but it's growing exponentially. This year, I think there were like 2,000-ish attendees at this large hotel that we were at, and the whole purpose behind the summit itself, and let me actually read to you what it says on their website. The summit is the premier forum for unclassified dialogue between U.S. government intelligence agencies and their industry and academic partners. That's what's right there on the website, intelsummit.org. In layman's terms, what it is an opportunity for government agencies within the intelligence community, which we call the IC. I'll refer to the IC all the time in this episode, and that's what I'm referring to, the intelligence community, which is actually an official number of agencies. I can't recall how many there are now, 26, 27, something like that, that are actually, quote, part of the intelligence community. And then our industry partners, or the private sector, and then academia. And the reason that we need to have dialogues, networking, meetings is because the U.S. government doesn't build, invent, innovate through the government alone. We obviously are part of a capitalistic society, and we rely heavily on our private sector partners to come up with solutions to problems that the government has. And in the intelligence community, you might imagine that happens to deal with intelligence analysis, intelligence collection, counterintelligence, all of these different things. So some things the government comes up with, some processes we develop. When I say we, I mean the government. But other times, particularly in the technological fields, we rely on industry. We take advantage of the competition that's out there between multiple private equity firms and private development companies, like the big ones you've heard of, Lockheed Martin and others, right? The big defense contractors. And we rely on their competition to create the greatest military equipment that we have today, and the greatest military equipment in the whole world. For those of us that are watching here on the YouTube, you can see that I've got my new T-shirt here. I really like it. It's a picture of one of my favorite rappers here, Jay-Z. So for those that have been listening for a while and maybe took a guess that I wasn't into that kind of thing, but no, I'm a big fan nonetheless. So that's the head you kind of see peeking out here at the top of the camera if you're watching on YouTube. But nonetheless, okay. So it's important that the government, specifically the IC, works closely with our defense partners. Now, let me cut you off at the pass if you're being a little cynical and you're saying things like, well, it's the defense industrial complex, which is officially or originally, not officially, originally coined by Eisenhower after World War II when he became president. And that if it wasn't for this mass defense complex, then we wouldn't have we wouldn't be spending all the money that we spend on the Department of Defense and all the other IC agencies and all these other things. And it's really a hindrance to the U.S. Listen, that's not to say, right, that I wouldn't disagree that there are pitfalls in a design like we have, where there's companies related to the government interested in making money. Right? That's going to be a pitfall in no matter what scenario we're dealing with, no matter what environment we're dealing with, right? We have that issue in healthcare. Right? Doctors and medical labs and pharmaceutical companies, they're all profit-based, right? But they also, at the same time, are dedicated to healing patients, okay? It's not a perfect system, but it's a system that works. Well, we could actually argue healthcare could be a little bit better, but I think you get the point. It's not a perfect system in the DoD either, but it is a system that works. And what I would argue is by asking you a question, would you rather have another system? Would you rather have, say, the Soviet system that collapsed eventually in 91, or would you rather have the Chinese system that exists today that maybe you could argue is doing rather well from a technological standpoint? They're maybe making some nice stuff, some capable, military equipment, naval equipment in particular. They're pretty good at cyber. My first counterpoint to that would be a lot of that they stole from the United States, but that's neither here nor there. But those companies aren't profitable in the same way because they're part of the government and they're directed by the government what to make, how much to make, and what to charge. And so eventually, if you just read enough history, that system will eventually collapse. You know that's the case, and that isn't the case, at least that we've seen in history, right? With a capitalistic society, with an economy based on capitalism. Okay, so these defense contractors, again, although not perfect, are much needed. It's the reason we being the United States, have the ability to create such capable military equipment, because we allow the likes of the Lockheed Martins and Oshkosh to build these military vehicles and military weapons and then design and create the best ones, okay? What I will say is that throughout the years and years past, one of the hurdles that we've had, we being in the government and the defense industry, is that it takes a really long time to get a lot of things approved, to go through the procurement process, to go through the acquisition process. There has to be all of these different levels of approvals, and it sometimes can be burdensome. And what it does is it slows down the process, right? The last time that we had any system in place that was quick, relatively quick, was during World War II. when the threat was such that we knew we couldn't wait on anything. They were throwing money at the problem. The amount of money that we spent was astronomical, and we just built things and created more airplanes and designed more weapons, and we got out there and won the war as we should. But that's the last time we've been in that position. We haven't been in such a threat position where we needed to do that. So we curtailed things. We brought them back. We slowed things down, right? And then we had a challenge in the last couple of decades getting out ahead of those problems and then starting to develop things quickly. And we've noticed this specifically after 9/11, that countries like Russia and China, authoritarian countries, can snap their fingers, make things happen, and the U.S. has a difficult time keeping up because we have all of these approvals to go through, acquisition, procurement, all these things that I was saying. And so we have a challenge, and that is, how do we ensure that we're doing the right thing with the American people's tax money, but we're staying on course and we're being as quick and as efficient as some of these other countries, okay? This intelligence summit that I attended last week is designed to help that process, where industry partners, again, public and private, can get together, break down barriers, and discuss how we can get better. And I'm telling you, if you put your cynicism aside, this is something that you as an American citizen really want. You really want government and industry, the best of both, to be working closely together so we can make the best stuff to protect the United States. Trust me when I say that, okay? All right, so let me give you some of the keynote speakers. There were a whole host of them, all right? But these are some of the most senior leaders in all of the intelligence field in the government. Okay, so the first speaker was the director of the National Intelligence, DNI, the director of DNI, Director of National Intelligence, and that was Avril Haines. And I've seen her numerous times testifying in front of Congress. She is the boss. Okay, so for many years prior to 9/11, the Central Intelligence Agency was the premier and, let's say, highest station intelligence agency within the government. Right? The CIA was responsible for putting together the PDB, right? The Presidential Daily Brief. That the last person to sign off on that product before it went to the president every single day was the director of the CIA. Okay. After 9/11, President Bush and his team decided that there were some, and you've likely read about this, right? Being the history folks that you are, right? We knew that we had some communication issues, particularly between those intel agencies that focused on the foreign threat and those that focused on the domestic threat. The challenges between the CIA sharing with the FBI. And so one of the two major changes that the Bush administration brought in was, one, creating the Department of Homeland Security. And the second was to create the DNI, right? The Director of National Intelligence. This is the senior most position in all of the intelligence environment. And this is the person that is now the senior intelligence analyst and director, supervisor, boss, all of those things, before the president. Okay, so at the end of the day now, when the Presidential Daily Brief is designed, curated, put together every single day before it hits the president's desk, it goes through DNI, right? And this is right now Avril Haines, Director Haines. And she spoke first, and she had some great comments. You know, she thinks big picture. So she was talking about how we can work together in DOD to create a better environment, how she wants to do things like give access to secured facilities to private industry in certain manners, in a very limited manner, but in certain manners, certain times when it's needed. She's thinking of creating a one-time what they call a read-on process. So they will give access to classified information, which is one of the biggest hurdles between government and industry. Giving one-time access to classified information to certain companies, certain people in certain companies that are working on certain projects. Right now, that's kind of an arduous process. She wants to really streamline that. She's also doing things like putting in performance evaluations for employees within DNI, how would you say this? An evaluation of how these government employees, how often they're dealing with colleagues in industry, in the private sector, and how well they're developing and maintaining relationships within the private sector. So it's something they're actually going to be evaluated on and potentially even get bonuses for. So really just a change in the mindset, holistically, a change in the mindset as we continue to, try and keep pace or stay ahead of, I shouldn't say keep pace, but stay ahead of China and Russia in this new great power competition environment that we're in. Okay. Great comments by D&I when she was there. Also, let me read a couple of others here that I wrote down. I want to make sure that I get them right. So the deputy director of the FBI was there, Paul Abate. One of my favorite senior intelligence leaders during my career, Lieutenant General retired Bob Ashley was there. He left. His last post was director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He's now CEO of Touchstone Futures LLC. He was there to moderate one of the what they call plenary panels that were there. Let's see. David Cohen was there. He's the deputy director of the CIA. General Timothy Howe was there. He's the United States Air Force National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command commander and director. And there's a title for you. So Lieutenant General Jeffrey Cruz was there. He's the United States Air Force DIA director, the Defense Intelligence Agency. The director of the NGA was there, the director of NRO, NGA meaning the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the director of NRO, which is the National Reconnaissance Office. The two differences being the National Reconnaissance Office is the agency that owns and operates all the satellites, okay? And the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency is one of the customers, if you will. It's one of the analysis agencies that have access to NRO satellites and use those to gather information and then create analysis for that, all right? So it's the satellites that are in low Earth orbit and they're spinning around the globe as we speak right now doing their job are really controlled and operated by the NRO, but used by multiple agencies, right? CIA uses them and NGA, as I had mentioned. NGA is kind of a funny story. So it's like, most of the agencies in D.C. are three-letter agencies. You've heard this before, which three-letter agency, DEA, FBI, CIA, whatever it is. And the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, it was Director Clapper, actually, who was the director. They were really working on trying to get the acronym and get the letters down to 3. They really didn't want to have 4 because they wanted to be just like everybody else. This is the silly part of being in government work. And Director Clapper at the time said, well, if I just hyphenate geospatial intelligence, right? If I say National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, I can call it the NGA instead of the NGIA, and I can fit in with everybody else. So I read that in his memoir. I just thought it was kind of funny, right? The little things you do in the government, but nonetheless. So the point I'm trying to make here is that, the summit is it's a key meeting, right? And significantly high-ranking individuals come to these sessions, sit down and have panel meetings, and breakout sessions that they were dealing with a whole host of issues. And, it's just not something where, somebody within the CIA sends some deputy director of some back sub-agency in the back corner of Langley. No, the bosses come. And so it demonstrated the importance of the summit. And it was really cool. It was really cool to be there. So let me just put a fine point on this, on my opinion here as I'm giving it to you in terms of the government relation with industry. All right, just look at. I'll give you a historical reference. Look at Oppenheimer. Just watch the movie. Fantastic movie. But the point is that the process by which the government and industry came up with the nuclear weapon we eventually used in Japan is the same process, or a very similar process, that we use today. I mean, we took advantage of the scientists we had at our disposal in the United States, some of them being German, obviously, like Einstein and others, but U.S. scientists, British scientists, and we all worked together to create this, weapon that, we now have today. Yes, it was managed by the government in the sense, right? The government directed the program, but they let the innovators and the scientists and the thinkers be the ones to come up with how that weapon could be utilized. They weren't just government employees. It's the same way today. And it's a much better system than the system that you're going to see, or we do see, in Russia and in China. And so, how does it typically work? Well, what happens is the government comes up with a problem and it says, I have a need. I have something that I need a military capacity to do something, right? And they design a list of capabilities, and then they put that list out for contractors and other private sector firms to take a shot at, to say, listen, I can develop a capability that will fulfill all of these requirements. Okay. And then the government will choose 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it could be a whole host, whatever, depending on the size of the program. We'll choose certain companies to say, oh, we like your proposal the best. It's the cheapest, but it's the most capable and whatever. Sometimes we choose multiple parties and we say, okay, well, we need a new vehicle, and Oshkosh did the best in terms of the design of the vehicle, but I really like the way that this other company, let's say Lockheed, devised the intelligence sensors on the platform. So we're going to award Lockheed the Intel sensor piece, and we're going to award Oshkosh the actual vehicle construction, put the two things together, and we have a new vehicle, right? So now, in terms of a theme, there really was not a theme to the summit for the whole week, really. The theme is really just the purpose, the ultimate purpose, and that is, commingling between government and industry. But what was very clear is that artificial intelligence was, if there were to be a theme, it would be that. Almost every single plenary session, panel discussion, breakout section, when we were dealing with very, very particular, nerdy like Intel discussions, like, how do we make intelligence studies programs in college better? Some really, really niche stuff. Artificial intelligence somehow crept into the conversation and either became a key point of the talk, or at least even a sub point or a subordinate point, but nonetheless, it was still part of the conversation. And what was heartening to know, it was kind of split in half, right? It was that some of the things that we had learned were that, the threat increases in terms of our adversaries and their desire to get better at AI and to include AI in a whole host of government industries, right? China, Russia being key, as you might imagine. And so it's a little, I don't want to call it scary, right? But it's it's something to pay attention to. The threat is increasing in terms of our adversaries having access to AI and getting pretty good at it, right? But the heartening point is that we know that, right? That seems simple, but government and industry together are really getting after the problem. They understand how important AI is and how useful potentially it could be in a whole host of ways. And so for years now, and I would say even more than a decade, AI has been involved in the discussions for the future of the military in particular, and specifically and definitely within the intelligence community. All the way from technical advances like how do we use AI to sort through, hundreds of thousands of, let's say, Word documents looking for patterns that humans would miss and it would take forever to sort through, and technological advances like using, AI to determine certain things in images that we'll talk about in a little bit, all the way to theoretical things, using AI to allow us to identify problems we don't even see that we can then develop answers for, right? It kind of goes back to that, if you remember that famous press conference that Donald Rumsfeld gave when he was Secretary of Defense, when he talked about the unknown unknowns. One of the biggest challenges that we had in Iraq was not knowing how to fix the things that we didn't even know were broken. That's a concern today. And one thing that we know is that AI is helping us to identify the unknowns what we don't even know are a problem, so that we can then put some horsepower, some mental horsepower against that, and then fix those concerns, right? So all of this stuff is happening. Now, there's a fear factor here, in the sense that there's a lot of unknowns. Speaking of unknowns, there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to the ultimate capacity of AI. And those are valuable opinions. I mean, Elon Musk himself has said that AI is it's what keeps him up at night, and he thinks it could ultimately be the downfall of the human race. I don't know if I'd go that far, but then again, I'm not Elon Musk. But nonetheless, it's a valuable opinion. We don't know the future, and nobody today can tell you what the models that are being created today for AI are ultimately going to do. Nobody can tell you that, because we're all still learning. The challenge, though, that the U.S. has is that we can't take those opinions and have them stop us from moving forward. And the reason is because our adversaries are doing it, and so we're going to have to do it ourselves. Right? We can't let China and Russia move forward with AI development while we stand back and say, well, it's a little scary. We don't know where it's going to go. It could get a little sideways. So let's just let China and Russia maybe figure it out, and maybe they'll run into the problems and we'll be safe. Well, the world doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way because we're all interconnected, particularly because of the internet. And it doesn't work that way because what if China and Russia are successful in implementing AI policies, procedures, capabilities in all of their, or a lot of their, military services, and the United States is left behind because we were too fearful? It's almost kind of forcing our hand, right? So AI is here. The civilian world is going towards AI. Industry is going towards AI. The government's going to have to go towards AI. The military, we're going to have to do it. Now, as an aside, there was a Google rep that was at the summit this week, and you know, you can say that they would make this comment because it's beneficial for Google, but nonetheless, it makes sense. The Google representative said, listen, they've been doing AI for 15 years. They've been doing AI almost, if you could almost say, since the day they created the search engine. Right? Google has been using models to better refine search results for the actual user, for the independent user, so they can get access to the information they want. And they've been learning and training on those models for a very long time. So they're kind of already in the AI world. Now, for those AI experts out there, which I am not one, but I know there are technical differences between what Google was doing, say, 20 years ago in their search engine, and what, the capabilities of AI and the threat models today, or the language learning models today. And then you add on the possibility of quantum computing, and things just get exponentially crazy. But nonetheless, there was AI being born for decades prior to where we are today. Okay. And nonetheless, again, this is where the world is going, and we're going to have to stay up. We're going to have to keep up. But some potentially really cool things can happen when it comes to AI. So for example, there is something you may have heard of called Project Maven. Well, Project Maven was just that. It was a project that the U.S. government started working on with Google to combine multiple different data sets to help analysts sift through imagery to reduce the analysis required to identify what's in those images. So they would take the images themselves, they would take geolocational data, and they would take communications data. They would combine all of this, and they would allow the model to learn what was inside of those images. This is what a personnel looks like. This is what a platoon of soldiers looks like. This is what a T-72 looks like. This is what a T-80 tank looks like, on, and build on those models. So eventually you could take thousands and thousands of images, combine it with the other data platform, or the data sets that I talked about, and then have the AI, have the computer spit out what it believes it's seeing inside of these images. This could eventually save hours and hours and hours of manual labor, in a sense. Manual meaning humans have to look at each and every single image and say, yes, that's a T80, yes, that's a T80, 80, or a T90 or whatever. Right? It takes a very long time. Now you can have these models determine, or at least present to you, the indicators with a confidence level of what they're seeing, and then allow the humans who are still involved in the process to take a cut at it and say, yep, I agree. You were 98% sure that this is a T90. I agree with you. I took a look and moving on forward, right? So saving some time there. Also, there's some really cool development going on in what they're calling automated target recognition. And what does this mean? So this is the ability to do something very similar to Project Maven, not just on images though, in a whole host of other sensors, and gather enough information to allow the system, using AI, to determine what a target is inside of what we call the military operational environment, and then present that target for possible action. Meaning, like, these sensors gathered this data and they've seen that this is a Russian MiG located at this location and it's in a threat posture, so we can then send the information to whoever can target that MiG and, eliminate it from the battle space. Done. Instead of, again, having multiple data sets from all of these different sensors come in from all over the place, trying to combine it into one central location so a human can look at it and make that determination. So it can be done much more quickly. Now, one thing I want to say is that, and one thing that was reiterated throughout the 2 days that we were down at the summit here, was that there's still human interaction in all of the planning that's going on for the use of AI in the military. There's still human interaction. Okay, there are no plans to look forward into the future and say, we're just going to let, quote, the computer deal with this thing. Right? And we're going to let the computer identify a target, and then we're going to let the computer action the target, and we'll figure it out later. Right? That is not in the plan. And even if that were tangentially involved in any plan, it is so far into the future because of the capabilities that would be needed, the processing power, all of this stuff. We're not near that, right? So it's not even worth having the discussion at this point. Humans are involved in all of this stuff. We're just looking to get to a point when there needs to be fewer humans, or at least even the same amount of humans, but they're just doing less time-consuming work, the grinding, if you will, through all of these data sets where they can get closer, they can spend more time conducting analysis, actually doing the thinking instead of just the sorting, right? That's what we're looking for AI to do for us. One thing that we're going to have to approach, though, and this is, it's related to what I had just said in terms of automated target recognition. There's going to be a day when we need to make a decision on the ethics and the morality of this technology. Right? There's going to be a day, again, it's going to be far into the future, but there's going to be a day when a sensor or a combination of sensors is able to determine who a specific human being is walking on a street in downtown wherever, right? And has the capacity to verify who that person is and then action on that person without human interaction. That is going to happen someday. We would be silly to think that it can't. And what are we going to do? Now, the simple answer, or what might be the answer that comes right to mind, would be, well, we don't want anything to do with that. We being the United States, right? We're not going to be in a position to be giving robots, quote unquote robots, computers, the ability to kill humans, and without any human interaction. Which is not something that we're interested in doing. The problem is, and I don't have an answer today, the problem is, much like with the use of AI in general, we're in a scenario where it's possible that other countries will do that. Given what I know about what China's doing with its military, how it views the military and what the military can do, what China and Russia are doing in space right now, which is a whole different discussion. Anyways, it's pretty clear to me that other countries are going to use that capability. They're going to say, if I can have a system identify a human being and then action that target within seconds without having a human involved, I'm going to do it. And if that's the case, and the United States finds itself in a position where we have to keep up in what is called this sensor to shooter timeline, right? Where a sensor picks up a target and a shooter actions it. If China and Russia can reduce their sensor to shooter timeline drastically because they've removed the human decision, what is the United States going to do? We may be in a position where we have to maybe bend our ethics, if you will. Now, potentially, and this is something I've been thinking about for a while, potentially it might not be the problem in the future that we foresee it potentially being today. Now, what do I mean by that? Right now, we don't live in an environment where computers are on a day-to-day basis all of the time making decisions for us. For example, right, we don't have full self-driving cars. Right? Humans are still involved. The car can park itself at times and it can show you how close it is all over the place. But we're not at a point where we're just letting cars drive, aside from a couple of wacky YouTube videos, right? Letting cars drive all over the place and we're going to sleep in the back seat and all these, doesn't work that way, right? We still have two pilots in a plane, even though there's a computer making a lot of decisions for how that plane operates. There's still two pilots in that plane ultimately making decisions in full control. But that may be different in the future. And so we may be in a place 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years from now where there are so many decisions being made by computers on a daily basis that the idea that a weapon or a computer attached to a weapon would make a decision to kill an enemy combatant in the battle space without human interaction might not seem like that big of a deal. I mean, if you're talking about somebody who gets into their self-driving car every day, and then that car takes them to work, and then they get into the office, and machines are making their coffee, and there are robotic assistants that are coming into your office and giving you, whatever, you can come up with all these ideas. But if you're living in that environment where every single day you're surrounded by computers making decisions, you might not think there's an ethical problem in the same way that there is today when it comes to computers killing other people. I'm not advocating for it, but what I'm saying is it might not be the problem we think it is today. We'll see. The overall point to this whole discussion, though, is that whether we like it or not, AI is here, we're going to use it, and we're going to have to use it because our adversaries are using it. Plain and simple. Okay, another topic that was big at the summit was hacking. And specifically what was being discussed was Volt Typhoon. Now, if you've heard of this, Volt Typhoon is a Chinese hacking program. It's not just one entity, but a group of entities that are working diligently to conduct what are called zero-day attacks against American, others as well, but for us here, American critical infrastructure industries in order to create chaos eventually. Okay? China has shifted from conducting intelligence gathering to, with a focus on espionage, either dragging information out of the United States by using spies or actively targeting certain databases or whatever to try to extract information. What they're trying to do is place malware, typically through zero-day exploits, in critical infrastructure nodes so they can have access and then potentially control of those critical infrastructure nodes for whatever day coming in the future, at whatever time and for whatever purpose, I should say. Volt Typhoon has been going on for a while. It's also called Bronze Silhouette and Insidious Taurus as well. I love these government operational names. It's been going on for a while, but was released to the public last year in 2023. I want to say it was like May 2023, when the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, talked about, in particular, he talked about how Chinese hacking companies, part of this Volt Typhoon program, were implementing or inserting rather malware inside of shipping cranes across the East Coast. In particular, I believe he talked about Baltimore, and we've discussed this in previous episodes. And the malware had been there for years. It was dormant. Eventually, it was found, obviously. And the purpose of the malware, as NSA and other entities deconstructed the code here, there were botnets and a bunch of things. But as they deconstructed the code, found out that the purpose of the malware was to eventually take control of the shipping cranes. Now, why would somebody want to do that? Well, as we've talked about in previous episodes, we would use these shipping cranes for the military sustainment process. And if China ever found itself at war with the United States, say over Taiwan, they could manipulate the shipping cranes and then damage or even stop temporarily the sustainment process, putting goods on top of ships meant for overseas action, right? That's just one of the, let's call them sub-operations as part of Volt Typhoon. And the point that they were making at the summit was that it's going to take a very long time, if not, I don't want to say forever, but let's just say it's going to take a very long time to eradicate all of the malware that was inserted, and it's not just malware, but generally, all the malware that was inserted by these Chinese hackers across our critical infrastructure network. It's going to take a long time. Just last week, the Washington Post revealed that there was another compartment of critical infrastructure, ISPs, internet service providers, that had malware from Chinese hackers, part of Volt Typhoon, inside of their networks with the, again, purpose to control infrastructure like telecommunications and water and transportation. And the government revealed that Volt Typhoon was using the most lightly defended avenues into the network to take advantage of the system. And in this case, they were using home networks. And so clearly, if you have a router in your house, that router connects back to your ISP. And so they were using phones or phones that connect to the routers or the routers themselves and inserting certain malwares through zero-day exploits in order to send code and program language into those routers that found its way back to ISPs. And then once it made it to the ISP, it had plans to do other things. Okay. And the fear is that there's like no way to stop that. Right. That's one of the discussions that we had. And when I say no way, I mean, how is a government, a private entity, whatever, supposed to defend and protect against those type of exploits on every home router that's available in the United States? I mean, there's, nearly every home has a router, every business has a router, and most of them have multiple routers. And if it almost seems theoretically impossible to ensure that every single router within the United States is up to date and has the most up-to-date virus protection and malware protection. Somebody's going to screw that up eventually. Now, clearly, you can mitigate those concerns by getting most of these routers as up-to-date as possible. I understand that. But there's no way, theoretically, again, there's no way to protect all of them all the time. And so, are we living in a world, and again, this is a discussion that was had, are we living in a world where we just have to accept this and have to find a way to, once this malware is identified, to get rid of it as quickly as possible, as opposed to blocking it from ever getting here, because it just doesn't seem like that we're going to be able to get to that place. So it's going to take a while for the agencies involved, NSA being one of them because they deal with foreign threats. They the National Security Agency, to identify where all this code is and eradicate it. Now, what I will say is the good news story is they're doing a pretty good job, and a lot of this has been identified. Only some of it we're gonna talk about in an open source sense, right? But the government's doing a pretty good job at it too. And the other thing that I would say is there's a whole diplomatic angle to this. It's one thing for the intelligence community to identify the threats that are coming from China and Russia and other places. It's a whole nother thing for the State Department, which works in this world, in the diplomatic world, to approve its diplomats to discuss these things with the Chinese government directly and call them out by putting it out to the media. Right? What that says is the United States and our allies as well, but the United States in particular, is taking this very seriously. Right? A lot of times, a lot of these diplomatic, I don't want to call them games, but maneuvering happens behind the scenes. Because the United States does stuff, and then the Chinese do stuff, and the Russians do stuff, and it's all tied in. Hostages are tied to economics, or tied to military gains, or tied to cyber hacking. It's a very complicated world that these diplomats live in. And so when the State Department says, okay, the Chinese government, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, have decided to do these bad things, or the things we call bad, and we want to make sure we're being really serious. So we're not just going to send diplomats undercover back to China and have this underhanded secret conversation and tell them not to do it again. We're going to put it out to the entire world, and we're going to label it. And we're going to say, we know this is happening. We have proof that it's happening. And we know that it's the Chinese government, and we're telling you to stop. Right? So I know some of you may be thinking to yourself, well, what's a strongly worded open letter going to do? But in the diplomatic world, those are heavy steps. Those are big steps to take when you lay it all on the table and you say, you're doing these bad things, and I know you're doing it, and everybody else knows about it. I mentioned zero-day exploits a couple of times. For those that don't know, a zero-day is basically, it's the label for the amount of days that a private company knows what its weakness is, right? So if there's a backdoor, for example, inside of their network, let's say they're running a piece of software on their network, and they have no idea that there's an exploit. There's the potential to sneak through the network in this one area and implant code. If they don't know what that is, right? It's the unknown unknown. If they don't even know it's a vulnerability, then it's a 0-day. So if China found out that Microsoft, which has actually been a victim of Volt Typhoon, if China finds out that there's some exploit within Microsoft Word, they're going to take advantage of that without letting anybody know and continue to use that exploit before somebody finds out. That's exactly what's happened with this critical infrastructure stuff. There are vulnerabilities that companies that create software and other things that they don't even know yet that it's a vulnerability. Nothing's ever perfect. It happens when we get media hits all the time that Apple has a vulnerability, something in the Safari that ties to the iPhone, and quickly update your phone, whatever. It's just not a perfect system. So, and when you have governments with thousands and thousands and thousands of cyber actors that are working diligently every single day to find back doors into somebody else's network, eventually, playing the game statistically, you're going to find some vulnerability somewhere, and somebody's going to take advantage of it. The kind of scary part is that for years ago, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago, China was conducting 3, 4, 5, 6 0-day exploits per year, taking advantage of vulnerabilities. Now, the numbers are like 80, 90 0-day exploits a year. So China has really picked up on its mission to find itself inside of wherever it can, particularly, as I've said numerous times now, critical infrastructure. The one question is why? Why now? Is it because China's better at what it does? Has it learned? I think that's potentially true. I think that you do this thing long enough, you're going to finally get good at trying to find a backdoor into somebody's network. I think it's also potentially true that China's maybe trying to catch up in time, right? They have a whole plan. If you read their plan, that's supposed to culminate in 2047. That maybe they're behind the curve. Maybe President Xi has decided that he wants to expand. I mean, I don't know. I mean, we'll eventually, hopefully, find out. But nonetheless, when you move from 5 to 90 zero-day exploits per year, you're giving us the impression that this is a big deal. Okay, so it's going to take a while. Now, one good news story that came out of the summit too. There was one question that came from the audience. Switching gears here to the political sphere, there was a question about cyber defense, particularly in the mis and disinformation worlds, when it relates to the elections, and how if there's going to be a similar mis and disinformation landscape like there was in 2016, which caused a lot of tension on the internet, right? And people were getting access to information that simply wasn't true, and whether it's going to be the same way. And multiple agencies had said that's not the case. And they're so much so, and if I recall correctly, the deputy director of the CIA made this point, not because the CIA does anything domestically, but they work diligently to identify foreign threats, that the CIA was very confident that they have developed the cyber awareness, let's say, to be significantly more capable in this election cycle than they were in 2020, and then obviously way back into 2016. And so, admittedly, maybe the government as a whole wasn't as prepared as they should have been to protect the American people in terms of the information they were getting access to and whether that information was authentic or not. But they feel pretty confident that this time around things are going to be different. And there's no reason, we're not going to talk specifics about how they're doing that, right? You could, if you work in the cyber world, I'm sure you have either some knowledge of this or you can imagine how that would work. But just know that the process is different, but it's really more about the knowledge. It's more about how many advanced persistent threats, APTs, are out there that we know of. We know how they operate. We know what they like to do to try to push this mis and disinformation. So, I'm confident, based on what I had heard while I was there, that this should be a better cycle, at least in terms of mis and disinformation. And there's the counter argument that it's not something that the government should even really be involved in. Right? That, like, the internet should be a place for free speech, and whatever's out there is out there, and leave it to the people to make their own decision. And if it's fake news, right, to use a colloquialism, if it's fake news, then that's their fault, right? They should be the ones doing the research to determine that. And I understand again, I'll say it the same way. I understand the value of that logic. I get it. We want to live in a world where we can say whatever we want to say and take advantage of the brilliance that is the Bill of Rights. But when we're talking about cyber defense, this is specific. We're talking about known actors living overseas, operating overseas, using server farms that we know exist, using IP construction that we know exists, and blocking that information, whatever it is, through whatever social media platform or however they're trying to get it here, and blocking that information from getting here, because we know in particular that's just made up. This isn't about this, public square where we are allowed to say what we want to say and we're allowed to have debates over what we think is right or wrong. This isn't like, it's not a political thing. It's not about left or right or communist or socialist or capitalist or fascist. It's not about that. It's about knowing full well our adversary's intent. Their intent to flood the internet in the United States, in particular, during elections. They don't just do it to the United States, they do it elsewhere, to create chaos. So voting patterns change, and who knows who's going to be elected, and it's not just for chaos. It's specific and it's purposeful, right? It's not anything like you may imagine or you may remember from 2016, where there was a lot of reporting that, President Putin in Russia really wanted President Trump to win the election, or future President Trump to win the election, so he skewed all of these things to try to move the vote. It's not about that. It's They ultimately really don't care who's in office or who isn't. I mean, one candidate may, I guess, help in one way or another. They may feel more aligned with one candidate or another, but ultimately it's just about creating chaos and removing and degrading the confidence the American people have in the system. That's ultimately what they want. All right. So, and that's true specifically for China. China spends a lot of time trying to convince not only its own people, but convince Americans, also in the West, that the Chinese, the PRC's way of doing business is the right way to do business. That democracy is fragile, that you can't rely on politicians like Trump or Clinton or anybody else, and they make all these horrible mistakes. And then you run into these times where people are climbing up the Capitol on January 6th. I mean, who cares where they're in support of? You got a bunch of people climbing the Capitol and making the United States look like a fun house. That's the point. And then ultimately what you have is people then in the United States maybe looking towards China and saying, well, that model might not be as crazy as maybe somebody is telling me. I mean, China doesn't have anybody climbing on their buildings in Beijing, but the United States does. We can't even get our social media information correct. We got people running around thinking the election was stolen. Whatever. So again, this is not political. It's just about, again, the purpose of doing this. So in terms of China and Russia. And then with the ultimate purpose, let me bring this to its conclusion with China, would be for the American people to not feel confident in their politicians, not trust their politicians, and then potentially vote against, let's say, military aid to Taiwan if China goes after Taiwan. I mean, what better way, other than defeating the United States in a direct military battle, than not having to deal with them at all, because the American people don't want to supply the funding that we would need in order to defend Taiwan. Russia does the same thing. President Putin, whether you support Ukraine or you don't, I happen to, but again, that isn't ultimately the point. Whether you do or whether you don't, what is true is that Putin doesn't want us to. That's a fact. President Putin doesn't want the United States sending money to Ukraine so Ukraine can defend itself and ultimately create more damage for the Russian military and kill more Russian military members. He doesn't want that. And so, but it takes the American people to vote for politicians who will vote for the $61 billion, for example, that just went over to Ukraine a few months ago. But if Putin can create enough chaos and degrade enough confidence in the American system where either American citizens don't vote at all or vote against sending money to their politicians so they can send it to Ukraine, then Putin's in a better place. If we don't send the F-16s, if we don't give them the military equipment, if we don't support the Taiwanese Navy if they're ever invaded by China, win-win for them. And they do it through this whole mis- and disinformation process, which starts at the elections. When I say starts, I mean is focused on the election. That's when everybody's involved in the U.S. We love presidential elections. Ironically, most of us don't vote, right? But we all pay attention. Everyone's watching CNN and Fox and everywhere else. We're all talking about Trump and Biden and Harris. We're all doing it. And so that's where the focus is. And so hopefully, as the directors had said, we're in a much better place. And again, very much like the defense against malware attacks and critical infrastructure, we're not going to defend against all of it. But hopefully we can mitigate those Chinese and Russian cyber farms doing some damage to our knowledge base here in the United States. lastly, I want to cover one more topic before we close today. Looks like we're coming up on an hour now, and that's the space domain. That's another key topic that really crossed a lot of different breakout sessions at the summit, where we're going in space. And some revelatory information was provided, like 10 years ago the United States, and further back obviously, but like 10 years ago the United States had what we called space superiority. It's the same concept as air superiority in a military conflict, where if you have air parity, that means that you have equal control over the airspace as does your adversary. If you have air superiority, that means that you have more control over the airspace and your enemy has less. If you have air dominance, that means exactly that. Your enemy has absolutely no play in the air domain. Right? When the United States was operating in Iraq and Afghanistan for the last 20 years, we had air dominance. There wasn't any air defense asset on the ground that was going to stop us from flying UAS systems and shooting Hellfires whenever we wanted. We had air dominance. We used to have space dominance. Then for a while we had space superiority. Now we're getting close to space parity. We're not there yet, I don't think, in terms of what would be learned in the summit, but we're getting closer. And that's because China and Russia are really working hard to enter the space domain in the same way that the United States is, and some of our allies. So we don't get to live in a world any longer in the U.S. where we just get to freely operate in space wherever we like and put up whatever satellites we like, and we don't have to think about our adversaries. It's not true. Our adversaries are putting satellites into space all of the time, and our adversaries are being pretty offensive-minded when it comes to the space domain. And one of the reasons is there aren't a lot of rules in space. I mean, in fact, there are very few. There are international laws here on Earth, and there are certain ways we do business, and the UN tries to monitor this stuff, and NATO and other things, and there's best practices, and there's things that we should do and not do, and we all kind of know this, right? The rules are broken all the time. But nonetheless, there is, generally speaking, an agreed upon framework of behavior, both in the maritime domain, well, all three, I should say, the maritime domain, the ground domain, and the air domain. That's not the case in the space domain. It's kind of a Wild West up there, free for all. And so China and Russia are doing things that nobody's going to stop them from doing, and are a little aggressive. Right? They're making decisions about some of their equipment that's up there, let's just say, and it's actions in and around the International Space Station, for example, that they're doing things that seem a little crazy, and decisions that the United States would never make. Right? They're not interested in putting people in danger, for example. I can't necessarily say the same thing for our adversaries. Again, in Russia and China. So it's an increasingly complicated domain, an increasingly complicated environment, but again, much like AI, we know where we're headed in terms of the U.S. military and the intelligence community, the IC, and we know how much of an importance it is. We've created Space Command and the U.S. Space Force, and even though the United States Air Force had been responsible for the space domain for years, we peeled that off, and we now have the U.S. Space Force, and they're moving forward in a growing young service in order to really get a hold of what's happening in space and do it in their way, and again break off from the air domain because they're different. Just in the same way the Army Air Corps broke off and became the Air Force after World War II, we're doing the same thing for the Space Force. We could argue all day as to whether it's the timing is right and whether we should have waited, whatever. Doesn't matter. It's done at this point, and the Space Force is growing, and this is a good thing, right? The space domain is the next frontier, really. I mean, to sound a bit cliche, right? A little corny, but it is. So much of our daily lives revolves around the technologies that we have in space that it's only it's only obvious that we need to that we need to continue to look forward and focus on that domain, and we need to be defensive too. I mean, one of the points that was brought up while we were there, imagine losing GPS, now global positioning system, right? This is what designed by the United States, allowed to be used by the rest of the world for free. Russia and China don't use it; they have their own systems, but 98% of the world uses GPS. And they love it because it doesn't cost them anything. The U.S. maintains all the satellites that connect to everybody else's devices down here, their cars and phones and the rest. But they're doing some calculations, the government doing some calculations and saying, hey, if we lost GPS access within the U.S., let's say, because there's an attack and China or Russia went and knocked out a bunch of satellites, whatever, right? However they would go ahead and do that. If we lost the ability to communicate with global positioning for 15 minutes, it would cause a $1.5 billion deficit in the economy. Right? So it would cost us $1.5 billion is what I'm trying to say. Every 15 minutes. Every single 15 minutes. So if we had GPS gone for an hour, $6 billion. That stuff can add up. That's a lot of money. That's even for big boy countries like China and the United States and those massive economies. $6 billion an hour is a lot of money, and an untold devastation. Right, hospitals and water and there's so much in our daily lives that are connected to GPS and not just GPS alone. I mean, just the timing and positioning and everything else, PNT that deals with all the satellites, but nonetheless. So it's an increasingly complicated domain. The intelligence community is working to focus on it heavily, again, specifically for the Space Force and Space Command. And we know we need to continue to develop and adapt, and we're going to continue to rely on the space domain in order for us to operate with efficiency and effectiveness in the military. So we're already using satellites and space to support what we're doing here on the ground and on the other domains. We're going to continue to do that, and the goal, the plan is to stay, a few steps ahead of our adversaries. We're there now, right? I said it's being focused on by our adversaries. It's getting a bit more complicated. We don't have space dominance anymore, but that doesn't mean we're by any means lacking behind anyone else. We're not. We're still in the lead, and we're going to stay in the lead. But it's gonna require a little more time, a little more effort, a little more focus, and a lot more money. But nonetheless, we're doing that. So, okay, that was the Intel Summit from last week. A couple of days at the Intelligence and National Security Summit in and around D.C. It happens every year. It's a great experience. Talked about a lot of things. I hope to be able to attend next year with some colleagues and maybe do an episode on what the differences were between this year and next year, and if AI is still the focus and as much as it was this year, and we'll have to see. So hopefully this episode was interesting to give, again, a little bit more focus on the headlines, more so than the history aspect of our show here. But things are going well in the intelligence community, and we're working closely together with industry and academia to make the United States a safe place and continue to remain dominant in terms of our military capabilities. So that's all a good thing for us here in the U.S. at least. That's listening to this episode. So. Okay, headlinesinhistory.com. Check it out. Working on the website. Again, it would be great. I would be really appreciative if you head off to the donation page there. You could check out Patreon, which Headlines in History podcast at Patreon. Still working on the Venezuela update. We're going to be doing a little bit of Venezuelan history, and then we're going to have Alexandra Winkler on the show. We're going to talk about what's happening down in Venezuela. A very big deal here for South America and our side of the planet here in the Western Hemisphere. And we've got our plan done with my buddy over in the UK, Rob from Dark History. So a couple of weeks, we're gonna have our episode on the Battle of Saratoga, and I think it's really going to be kind of neat, a little bit different. Definitely a focus on history more so than headlines, and but I think it's going to be good, and we got some good chatter going on, and I think you guys will really enjoy that. So Stick with us. Thanks for joining me this week, episode 26, the Intel Summit discussion, and thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.